Thank you very much for hosting me this evening. Thank you, Dr. Al-Qasim, for the invitation, and thank you also for your participation. I visited Dubai many times in the last few years, but mostly to see the city, its evolving energy, and it's changed a lot. The last time I was here for work was in 2003 for the World Bank and IMF annual meetings that year. What I wanted to cover this evening was three things. First of all, to revisit some very significant and interlinked challenges that the world is facing right now. Big global trends that will shape the prospects for economic development and for social development and for the well-being of our planet. And those 5 shifts I wanted to talk about was the changing centre of economic and political gravity in the world, 2 changing patterns of poverty and inequality, 3 demographic changes, 4 environmental degradation and climate change, 5 new technologies, and those are all interlinked, and you can start the narrative in any one of those. But I wanted to revisit those with you and discuss those with you because I think that they comprise in large part the challenges that the world will face over the next century. Secondly, to link that back to something called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which has a number of goals and targets which have been agreed by governments in 2015. And in many ways, they address those challenges. And thirdly, I wanted to make an argument for research from the modest perspective that we don't know everything about how the world will evolve in the face of those challenges. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we do in the UN, in my research centre in Geneva on social policy. So just to start on those challenges, the world in the last 3 or 4 decades has experienced significant changes economically and politically. The centre of economic gravity in the world is reshifting back to the east and to the south. Now, it's particularly interesting to look at this in a long-term trend. If you wind the clock back 2,000 years, the centre of political and economic gravity in the world was very much in the east and the south. And then with the discovery of the Americas and the trading routes from Europe, that shifted more towards the Atlantic Ocean. But now, with particularly China, growth in India, growth in many other countries in the south and the east, that's shifting back. Now that has ramifications for not just economic power, but also political power. The Chinese economy is set to overtake the US economy by 2030. The Indian economy is set to overtake the US economy by 2050. And many economies, Brazil, Turkey, Argentina, South Africa, Cambodia, are growing in productivity, innovation, they're investing in research. And the world is undergoing this fundamental shift quite quickly. Now, it brings political influence on the world stage. And we've seen, after some delay, China being more active in the multilateral sphere, investing more in international cooperation and spending in areas where others are retreating. Perhaps realizing this, which one? I'll take this one off. Um, some countries are retreating from cooperation. I would say the United States in particular, but also my own country, the UK, in its efforts to withdraw from the EU. Its somewhat less engagement on the international stage is withdrawing, perhaps trying to protect its privilege, trying to protect its position in the context of this shifting economic and political gravity. Now, this is important because it conditions how the world will cooperate on some of the other challenges I'm going to talk about, in particular environmental degradation, climate, poverty, inequality, and technology. So on poverty and inequality, just the facts of the matter first. Partly because of very strong growth in the countries that I just talked about, the world has got a very good story to tell on reducing money poverty, income poverty. The number of poor people in the world defined as living on less than $1.90 a day has dropped significantly, but it's still about 10% of the global population, about 767 million people. Because China, India, and other economies have been growing more quickly than those in the OECD, global inequality has also fallen. The Gini coefficient is a rough measure of inequality, and it has, I have some numbers here somewhere. That's right, yes. In 1988, it was 69.7, but that had fallen in 2013 to 62.5. So overall, the world is compressing in some degrees, particularly if you leave out countries that have been suffering from conflict. And the biggest gains in reducing that inequality have been since 2008. But it's not all a pretty picture, because within many parts of the world, particularly North America, Europe, and Asia, inequalities have been growing significantly within countries. We're living in an era of the rise of the elites. Now, that's not been the case in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, but inequalities there were so high to begin with, they're still living in the context of very high inequality. So we've seen a mixed picture. Poverty has fallen. Globally, inequality in the world has fallen. But inequalities within countries and within societies where they're closely felt have grown. Now, why has this happened? People have their own policy or ideological perspectives on why inequalities within countries have grown. And because I'm talking with you tonight, I will offer mine. In part, I think it's because of the economic model that we've chosen to follow, particularly in the last 40 years, where we have sought to make markets work as well as possible. We've reduced the role of the state to a considerable degree, and we've encouraged a degree of financialization of our markets, which again has encouraged people competing to maximize profits within short periods. And we've seen a concentration of assets and a concentration of wealth that has become self-reinforcing. At the same time, our economic model has also encouraged consumerism, which has promoted a shift from community to the individual, from solidarity perhaps to selfishness. And we've seen a move away from the values that have held communities and countries together in the past when they've had to work together to resolve issues. So the economic model itself has thrown up considerable challenges and has possibly reinforced this growth of inequality. Does that matter if poverty is falling? Many people would argue that it does not matter. But I think in time, you'll start to see stresses within communities because of these inequalities. You'll see jealousies, you'll see a breakdown in social cohesion. You'll see gated communities, and you'll see a world of haves and have-nots that is not sustainable. So it's something that we need to address going forwards, unless we want that to exacerbate some of the other challenges that we're going to be facing. And as I said, all these are interrelated. So the third one I'm going to talk about is demographic change. In 2015, we were living in a world of 7.3 billion people. By 2030, it will be 8.5 billion people, and by the middle of this century, just under 10 billion people. So considerable stresses in terms of resourcing those people, giving them a fair chance, economically, politically, and in terms of the natural resources that we have on the planet. Second big demographic change is aging. With the exception of many African countries, which are still growing and producing young people, it's still a very young continent. The rest of the world is aging. We've got lower fertility rates, we've got higher life expectancy, and the dependency ratio of particularly older people who have stopped working and younger people that are still working is falling. Now that raises huge challenges for the sustainability of our fiscal policy. You have fewer people paying taxes. You have fewer resources that the state can orient towards delivering services, such as health or education or even care. So that probably requires a rethink of our economic model to some degree to ensure that we can continue to provide these services in the future. So aging is a huge challenge. Another challenge is mobility and managing mobility, so migration. Why do people move? There are some very obvious reasons. Conflict leads to displacement, so that's one. Fear of persecution is another. Insecurity. Disasters, increasing in number, particularly because of growing temperatures and sea level rise. But a more basic reason is people move because they think they can make themselves and their families better off. And that's a normal thing to do, and it's characterized human history. Now, when there are growing inequalities in the world and differences between different places, when there are increasing climate shocks, when there are opportunities to be able to move, more people are going to be moving. So in 2015, there were 244 million migrants in the world, sending back, I think, close to $500 billion in remittances. The pressures on migration are only going to grow. They're not going to go down. So this is not something that you can solve, again, by putting up walls or borders or by blocking people's natural aspirations to improve their lives. This is something that will need to be managed through cooperation between countries. And the last shift in demography is one that I can see very clearly from Dubai itself. It's urbanization. An increasing number of people living in cities, close together, needing resources, services, transport, waste disposal, clean water. And that also poses a huge challenge to how we organize ourselves and our access to resources. So two more big trends. The penultimate one is environmental degradation and climate change. In many ways, we've been able to grow so well after the Second World War because we've been free riding on our natural resources. We've not been internalizing the full costs of the resources that we've been using, and we've not been accounting for the externalities that they produce, particularly in terms of pollution. And that has led us to borrow from the future. That has led to probably higher standards of living than would otherwise have been the case. But it's also led to pollution, which has created climate change. And it's also led to some rapid declines in the natural capital of the world, the animals, the plants, the ecosystems, the biodiversity. So it should be obvious that that's not a sustainable way that the world can carry on. Partly because we lose the opportunities for innovation that exist in that natural world. Who knows how many cures for diseases that we have now or may have in the future are contained in those resources that we are slowly getting rid of. And the last challenge is on technology. Now, my argument on technology is that this is the one we know least about. So people that talk and claim to know what will happen with technology are probably stretching their mandate a little bit. On the one hand, we have a scenario in which people say that technologies will connect us better. They will allow us to access services better, health, education, knowledge. They'll help us to do things more efficiently. They'll connect us, creating more human capital. And then we have scary, as Jeffrey Sachs, one of our colleagues this morning, called the dystopian scenarios, where technology will lead to no jobs. So people have a lot more leisure time but have no money to buy anything. The consumer model breaks down. And to be frank, we don't know. We don't know what will happen. And we don't know how that will be shaped. But we do know that if we put in place certain checks and balances and certain complementary social policies, that we could probably manage it better. So if there are to be job displacements, then having a strong social protection system that safeguards people through change is going to be very important. If there are going to be divides in access, as we saw with mobile telephony in the 1990s, some people had phones and some people didn't. That creates a divide. So there are ways of managing access in the future so that those technological divides don't arise. So again, something that we don't know what will happen, but something that's very manageable. So given all of these challenges, which are very significant and deep, are going to change the structures of our economies and societies, what can we, and I mean we as people across all borders in all countries, do to help manage this? Now, in 2015, governments of the world came together and agreed a very ambitious development agenda called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it has, 17 goals and 169 targets that sit underneath it. In part, it was born from the UN, but it was actually agreed and negotiated by governments that have ownership of that, with contributions from academia and civil society, etc. Now, in some ways, those goals and targets are a response to the challenges that we will face. But because the goals are meant to be interlinked, education impacting on skills, impacting on jobs, impacting on migration, impacting on health, it's a very, very complex system, and it's difficult to see how these things are interrelated. It's difficult, the difficulty is amplified when you have these large underlying trends that go underneath it on technology, demography, climate risks that we may not have seen the bottom of yet, maybe tensions because of inequality, different growth patterns in the world. The complexity amplifies. So my simple point here is that we need to invest in knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge that we can capture from past experiences, but there's a lot of new knowledge that we need to find very quickly if we're to have answers to these questions. So that leads me to my final point. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the institution that I work in. It's called the UN Research Institute for Social Development, and we're based in the UN in Geneva. Now, we're unlike some of the other UN agencies in that we don't have governments or member states on our board. So we have some independence, some academic independence when it comes to challenging received wisdom and questioning political assumptions or political positions. But we do research that puts people at the centre. So wherever we approach a problem or an issue or a challenge, whether it's technology or demography or social protection systems or jobs, we always try to do so with the human at the centre of the issue. And through that, we try to offer advice both to governments, to UN agencies and to others on how to design social policy that can mitigate perhaps some of the challenges that we face and certainly maximise the opportunities. So that is what we do in our research institute. Some of the topics that we look at the moment include technology and human rights. So how do these new technologies interact with the maximisation of human rights or the diminution of human rights. Another area that we have looked at or looking at the moment is inequalities. How is the current pattern of inequalities, and not just income and wealth inequalities, inequalities related to age, to gender, to disability, how will that impact on the prospects for sustainable development? How can we achieve good political outcomes in an era that's characterized by concentrations of wealth and power? Another area that I find particularly interesting is something that's termed the social and solidarity economy. It's usually called the social economy in Europe, it's called the solidarity economy in Latin America. And these are specific economic entities, such as cooperatives or other groups, that they still may have a profit motivation, but they also explicitly include social and environmental objectives in their top line. So perhaps they do that through having staff ownership of the entity, or perhaps they deliberately have a higher cost base because they use recycled materials. But in whichever design it is, it's not just the profit motive that drives their behaviours, it's also explicit social and environmental objectives. And that's a very useful frame of analysis when looking at how we can achieve these integrated, sustainable development goals. So that's where I wanted to leave it. Thank you again very much for your time and for listening to me. I'm here for the World Government Summit along with my colleague and long-time collaborator professionally, Dr. Claire Malamet, who's the head of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. In the World Government Summit, we're discussing precisely these challenges and how governments can change the way that they do business in terms of the policies that they set to address some of these challenges. But I think it's a broader conversation than governments. And I think, as I've tried to argue, it's one in which the research community, the academic community, has some insights to be able to offer, partly because they sit outside of the political sphere and they can contribute knowledge and evidence.